begin transmission. We finally made it to insects, my favorite group to talk about. This is an incredibly diverse, interesting group of animals, and everywhere we've gone on this planet, from the tropical rainforests to the deserts, we encounter these flying, burrowing, digging, swimming arthropods. And they have 6 legs, they have hard exoskeletons, 1 pair of antennae, and they are just remarkable creatures, full of really interesting stories about how they avoid their predators, how they catch their prey, camouflage and venoms and toxicity, and all kinds of interesting life history to talk about. For example, just one quick example, this species here, this is an assassin bug, and assassin bugs are usually ambush predators with an incredibly potent neurotoxic venom, and they wait for their prey to come near and then pounce and stab with a piercing mouthpart called a rostrum, and they inject their venom, liquefy the insides of their prey, and then slurp it up like a delicious milkshake. Well, if you look closely at this particular assassin bug, on its back you can see the corpses of its victims. This is a pretty unusual method of killing its prey. After it attacks them, it doesn't just discard the corpses. Instead, it glues the corpses to its back. And so the more successful the hunter is, the more corpses it will have on its back. You can see here that this is an ant specialist killer, and so every time it attacks an ant, slurps up all the insides and then throws it on its back, and so you have an increasing mountain of body count, so you can know for sure how many insects has this particular assassin bug killed. Now, why would they do that? We're not 100% sure, but it could afford some maybe camouflage. So if it smells like an ant and maybe looks like an ant, it can get closer to ants and then can eat them. Or it might offer some protection from predators if you have to burrow through all these decaying corpses, or even just all this extra exoskeleton. You might be more protected from predators. But one intriguing hypothesis is that this is actually a sexually selected trait. So during mating season, there's some evidence that female assassin bugs are more attracted to males with larger trophies on their backs. So they go out and hunt these ants, put them on their backs, and then that indicates indirectly, not too subtly, but indirectly, the fitness of that male assassin bug. Presumably, the more ants you can kill, the better your genes are, the better you are at hunting, and then the more likely you are to get a mate. And so the female assassin bugs tend to like these, to be attracted to the male assassin bugs. Actually kind of see the same type of strategy in human mating rituals as well. So if you think about how males display their wealth, whether it's with clothes or cars or houses, and then the females tend to be more attracted to the ones with bigger and better stuff. So this kind of trophy display of fitness is pretty common throughout the whole animal kingdom. It doesn't always work out well though, so be cautious about following that path to success. Another interesting creature is this one right here. This is one that Dave caught, and he's very pleased with himself. Look at that proud face right there. A gigantic grasshopper creature, and these creatures roam the plains and are quite dangerous in large groups. So we are always well armed whenever we travel to the sands down south, because there are some voracious grasshoppers down there. Insects are both interesting, fascinating. They're also potentially dangerous. They also are incredibly important to the ecosystems. So I'm excited to tell you about their classification, their anatomy, physiology, and then during lab we'll really talk about kind of their benefits and harms to humans and the environment, and kind of think through an appropriate response now that we're here on this new planet full of insect life. Now, certainly there are a lot of insects that are beneficial and many more that are also harmful, but that's not the only reason to study insects. Some of them are just fascinating, like this beautiful hoverfly here with the stripes and the curious green speckled eyes, Or take, for example, this wonderfully fascinating caterpillar right here with a big stack of heads on his head. So this is known as the Mad Hatterpillar, and this Mad Hatterpillar, every time it molts, it leaves its head on. So each of these little heads right here, this is when it was a little first instar larva, and then second, third, fourth, fifth. Each time it molts, it sheds most of its skin, but leaves the casing of its head on its head. We don't know why it does this. Maybe it's for protection, similar to the assassin bug. So maybe intimidating rivals. Maybe it's just a fashion choice. Maybe it's an accident. I don't know. But it's so wonderfully strange and interesting. So it's the Mad Hatterpillar. And when we look at all of the insects, there are millions of different species, and they all belong to Subphylum Hexapoda. And the class is Insecta, and we're mostly going to focus on the class Insecta within Subphylum Hexapoda, but we should know a few attributes of the hexapods in general. Hex means 6, and poda means foot, so the hexapods are the animals with 6 legs, and they're going to include insects for sure, but also little creatures like Columbella, the springtails, and this little guy is a tiny detritivore, and springtails are actually incredibly numerous and common in forest ecosystems, so they're really important for the decomposition and nutrient recycling of leaf litter in forest communities. And they're called springtails because they have a little spring under their abdomen called a furcula, and it shoots out, and they can jump incredibly high for their size. But you notice springtails have 6 legs, but they lack wings. They have antennae and compound eyes, but they almost look a little bit like velvet worms, right? So they kind of have a soft cuticle. They're segmented, and their legs don't quite look as jointed and segmented as some of the other hexapods. So we're not going to talk very much about other hexapods, but you should know that there are some here. We're mainly going to focus on class Insecta. So how do you tell insects apart from Chelicerae, from Chelicerata and Crustacea and Myriapoda? Well, similar to Crustacea and Myriapoda, they have mandibles and maxilla. They don't have maxillipeds like the centipedes, and they don't have maxillipeds like the crustaceans either. So just mandibles and maxilla. And then they have 3 tagmata. And if you remember, the myriapods have 2. The Chelicerata, it's a little varied in there, and it's also varied in the crustaceans. But these guys have 3. They have a head, a thorax, and the abdomen. And you can tell that they're really distinct, so probably the most distinct of any group. The head is separated from the thorax by a distinct pinch in the neck, and then the thorax is distinct from the abdomen. The abdomen, the wings extend from the thorax, and the legs all extend from the thorax. So the abdomen is on the rear past the last leg. They also have 6 legs, and nothing else in that we know of has 6 legs. You know, the Chelicerata have 8, the crustaceans have 10, these guys have 6. So 6 is a pretty unique number of legs. They also have 1 pair of antennae. So again, contrast that with the crustaceans, which have 2, the Chelicerata, which have none. The Myriapoda also have 1. And then the best distinguishing feature of Insecta are their wings. These wings are incredible. They usually have 2 pairs of wings. A few species, a few groups don't have wings at all, or only have 1 pair, but generally insects are going to have 2 pairs of wings. And these wings allow them to exploit a tremendous diversity of habitats, and they make them incredibly active and incredibly good at escaping predators and catching prey. So wings are their kind of superpower. Aside from that, there's 6 legs, so 6 legs and wings are the best synapomorphies of this group. As a whole, collectively, this kind of suite of characters, we need to use this whole suite of characters to distinguish Crustacea and Chelicerata and Insecta from each other. If we look at the phylogenetics, I just want to point out very briefly that these are our hexapods that we're not going to really talk about. including the little springtails here. This is the furcula I was talking about. You notice that these are intognatha versus ectonatha, and that refers to the placement of their jaws. So natho means jaws. Into means inside, so in the intognathan hexapods, their jaws are inside their heads, and in the ectonathan hexapods, they are external. And we're really going to focus on class Insecta, and then Insecta, we can see that they have two main lineages, the Paleoptera and Neoptera. Although the Paleoptera, what kind of phylogenetic group would the Paleoptera be, with this ancestor and then these included? That would be paraphyletic. You have a common ancestor, but not all of its descendants. So Paleoptera is a paraphyletic group, and it's really just used to describe the wing. So we'll talk about Paleoptera versus Neoptera a little bit later when we're talking about the wings. And that's really all I want to point out here. This has a lot of the synapomorphies we just talked about. This right here is a zoomed in picture of the most dangerous animal in all of human history. And it's not a human, it's not a snake or a shark or a spider. This is the tip of a mosquito's proboscis. Mosquitoes have killed more people than people have. So if you include all of war, where millions and millions upon millions of people have been killed by other humans, mosquitoes annually kill more people than war does. So these are incredibly important individuals. Like we mentioned earlier, these are the ultimate killers of humanity on this planet. But we have to contrast that. So they're important because they're harmful, and we know this. They're also important because they are beneficial. And most of the flowering plants rely on insects. And one of the things our world is, well, our Earth is missing really two things. We're missing the flowering plants and insect diversity, and those two things are coupled. Those are correlated together. When we lost the insects, we also lost the diversity of plants and flowers and a lot of the beauty that is in ecosystems. Insects are incredibly important for the ecosystem as food sources for higher organisms, but also as connections between the decomposition, nutrient recycling, and the food web as a whole. So you can't just remove the insects and expect the nutrients to cycle the way they're supposed to, plants to be pollinated the way they're supposed to, and decomposition to happen as it is supposed to. So insects are important because they're harmful to humans and beneficial to humans. And all the things we talked about, the more specific things we talked about as importance of arthropods a few lectures ago, those apply well to insects as well. Part of the reason why they're so important is because they're so mind-bogglingly numerous. There are more insects than everything else. So throughout this whole semester, we've been talking about animals, and we started with the protozoa here, and the little unicellular eukaryotic organisms, and then we've been working our way through the invertebrates. This is just a small, tiny fraction of the life on this planet. We have a good number of plants, and we're most familiar with vertebrates. And when we look at the number of species described, vertebrates are only 4%, which is a tiny, tiny number, especially when you consider that vertebrates are disproportionately represented in species counts because we're disproportionately interested in them. 57% of all species described are insects. So that's over a million and counting, and there are some estimates put the total number of insect species between 8 and 30 million. And so it's just a remarkable number of species. If you were randomly to pick out any individual species from a giant bag of animal species, then over half the time it would be an insect. It would take you a long time to pull out a leopard or a tiger or a hummingbird. So insects are incredibly numerous, over 50% of described species, many, many more that remain undescribed. For example, this is, you may have seen these around. These are sometimes called daddy longlegs, although in different regions that's reserved for harvestmen. But these are also called skeeter eaters, but they're actual. They don't eat mosquitoes.
nor are they really daddy long legs. They are crane flies. Crane flies are also incredibly speciose. It's a group that there are more species of crane flies described than there are vertebrates, which is just astounding. So this little group right here of crane flies, there are over 11,000 species described, which is more than all the mammals and birds and reptiles combined. Maybe if you added fish in there, you'd get near 11,000. But at least all of the terrestrial vertebrates, there's less than 11,000. So you would pull out, more crane flies from that big bag of species than you would mammals. So bottom line is insects are incredibly diverse. There are so many of them. And they're large and they're small. They live in all different kinds of habitats, from tropical rainforest to desert environments. Even some live in Arctic regions. They live in, some are aquatic, most are terrestrial. Very few are marine though, so there's not very many ocean voyaging insects. They're mainly, they can be found on beaches and in salt marshes and brackish water, but they're primarily terrestrial and in freshwater. Earlier in the semester we talked about this little microscopic wasp that's about the same size as an amoeba. This little parasitoid wasp is part of a group called fairy wasps, and they're just incredibly tiny, but they still have 2 pairs of wings, antennae, compound eyes, advanced brain, and they still can sense chemicals and follow trails. They mate and lay eggs and enjoy life. And even though they're tiny, so having a microscopic flying thing is just incredible to me. They can also be fairly large for an invertebrate. And if you remember what's the constraining feature of size in invertebrates, there's really 2 things. The first is the weight of their exoskeleton, because the larger they get, the heavier it is proportional to their size. And then secondly, their tracheal system, their respiratory system, the larger it is, the more inefficient it is. So if you're drawing oxygen directly from the air into individual cells, that becomes much more costly and inefficient the larger you are. So there are 2 main constraints to the size. Even so, you have organisms like this giant Dobson fly, which can have a wingspan of almost a foot, most commonly about 8 inches. And it has pretty intimidating looking mandibles, but those it's pretty harmless. Those are really mainly for fighting other males during mating combats and holding onto the females during mating. So the mandibles aren't really, they're intimidating but not dangerous. We could also think about length as far as insects, and this giant walking stick, which can be over almost 2 feet long, is the longest insect. And these are remarkably camouflaged creatures. They are called stick insects because they look like sticks and they're insects. They still have 6 legs, but the camouflage, even the mottled kind of mossy organic look on their backs is just perfect. And so stick insects are one of my favorites. We can also think about weight. So this is the Goliath beetle. This is the largest insect by weight, and it weighs about 100 grams, which is, if you don't know how much that weighs, that's about 3.5 ounces. And if you don't know how much that weighs, just imagine a bowling ball that also weighs 3.5 ounces, and that'll give you a good comparison for how much the Goliath beetle weighs. Now in insects, we have all kinds of different feeding strategies. Almost everything you can imagine, from parasitic organisms like bedbugs and lice and fleas, and their parasitic lifestyle is going to be exhibited by certain adaptations to their anatomy and physiology, their morphology. So if you're going to live on another animal, these aren't endoparasites, these are going to be ectoparasites, and they're usually going to be either dorso-ventrally flattened, like a bedbug or a louse, or laterally flattened, like a flea. And that's just to help it adhere close to the body surface and avoid being scratched off or picked off. So this bedbug here is a parasite, and they're usually going to eat blood, and oftentimes they're going to be transmitting diseases to their hosts because they're going to have multiple hosts in some cases. And so ectoparasites is a really common strategy. You also have predators, which find and consume many other insects or worms or mollusks, or sometimes when they're big enough, other vertebrates. So like a praying mantis can take down a hummingbird. Some large beetles could take down a frog. There's a giant water scorpion that pretty routinely eats frogs and tadpoles. So vertebrates aren't immune to being predated on by insects. And look at this pretty obvious predatory beetle here. This is a tiger beetle. Incredibly fast flyers and runners. And we see the obvious mandibles there for ripping into their prey. We also have a tremendous number of parasitoids, and just one more thing about how numerous insects are. There are more parasitoid wasps by species than there are species in all the other groups we talked about all semester combined. So all of the things we've learned about, there's more diversity and species in just parasitic wasps alone. And here you can see a poor caterpillar that's been stuffed to the brim with parasitic wasp larvae. Each of these little oval-shaped things is a wasp larva. They will pretty soon burst out of this caterpillar and cocoon and then turn into adult wasps. So if you recall our discussion earlier, we should be able to distinguish between parasites, parasitoids, and predators. Parasitoids have a single host and usually kill their host. They also have a free living stage of their life cycle. Saprophagous insects are also pretty common, and these, as I mentioned earlier, are really important for decomposition. So saprovores eat decomposing bodies. So here we have burying beetles, and burying beetles are really important for getting rid of dead animals. So if a mouse or a bird or even remarkably an American bison dies, these beetles will come and dig a hole. That's why they're called burying beetles, because they'll actually dig underneath the corpse of the animal until it's buried, and then they'll come pile on dirt, and so they're burying beetles. And then they lay eggs inside the corpse, and then the larvae eat the corpse as it's decaying. So it's an incredibly efficient process of recycling all those organic nutrients that are in the dead body back into the soil and back into the food web. So saprophagous insects are really important. We also have phytophagous insects. These are herbivores, these are plant eaters, and phytophagous insects are incredibly numerous, as are all insects. This right here is a leaf beetle larva. And if you look closely, so one thing about phytovores is that they are often really exposed. Their numbers are, their individual numbers are really high compared to predators and parasitoids. And so they're usually the target. They're usually the prey species of most of the predators and parasitoids. And therefore, they're going to have some really remarkable ways of defending themselves. This one particularly, if you look closely, it looks like it's been parasitized by some wasp or something. You see that same kind of individual oval things inside its body. Well, those aren't larvae actually. It actually secretes this oozy, gluey, gelatinous, blobby stuff onto its back. And then every time it defecates, it flings the poop up into the blob, and it just kind of gets absorbed into this oozy-goozy, blobby, poopy mess. And so what this is called a fecal shield, and it prevents predators, because to get to that delicious beetle larva, you have to bore through very not delicious fecal material. So fecal shields is a way to avoid predators for phytophagous insects. You also have toxic. You also have really. You have some toxins that they can sequester from plants. You have some camouflage. So lots of ways to avoid being eaten by some of the most eaten animals on the planet. Within all the diversity of insects, they have a lot of different kinds of mouth parts. But largely, I'm going to split these into two main categories, and that's going to be mandibulate mouthparts versus haustellate mouthparts. And both mandibulate mouthparts and haustellate mouthparts have the same components. They all have mandibles and maxilla. They all have upper and lower lips, a labrum and a labium, but they're going to be modified for different things. So first we'll talk about the mandibulate mouthparts, and then we'll talk about the haustellate mouthparts. So mandibulate mouthparts are essentially what you think of when you think of mandibles, and then the haustellate mouthparts are for piercing and sucking, either plant juices or insects themselves. So this creature right here, this ant, this is a trap jaw or a trapdoor or lock jaw ant. There has a lot of different common names. But what you see here is some really fantastic mandibles, and you see a really long sensilla, a little hair right here. This is the trigger. So it can lock its jaws back so they're perpendicular to the body. And then whenever that little hair meets prey species, the jaws snap shut with incredible force and speed. This is one of the fastest moving biological mechanisms on the planet. Really incredible example of prey capture. So this ant obviously has mandibulate mouthparts, and he looks pretty intimidating, little mean looking, but he wanted me to let you know, his name is Antonio. He wanted me to let you know that you shouldn't judge a book by its cover, and sometimes he's actually a little sensitive soul. He likes early mornings with a cup of tea, and he's recently taken up knitting. So you can't always judge an animal because it looks mean. Sometimes there's more to them than meets the eye. But he does have mandibles, and he will chomp your finger if you get too close. So mandibulate mouthparts versus haustellate mouthparts. This is an example of haustellate mouthparts. This is an assassin bug. The assassin bug is, they're typically ambush predators. They'll find a leaf or a flower, and they'll wait for their prey to come to them. And what you notice is the prey for this particular assassin bug. This is a bee, and bees are well known for being venomous. They have a stinger with poison glands. And so this assassin bug has defeated something that's about the same size of it as it, with that's also highly aggressive and dangerous. So the way they accomplish this is the assassin bug has toxic venom as well, and it paralyzes its prey almost immediately. So it stabs the prey, and then the prey is almost completely immobilized within less than a second. So there's no chance really for the insect to fight back. So assassin bugs are very efficient predators, and as you can see, there's no mandibles to speak of. They don't have these laterally opposed mouth parts. Rather, they just seem to have like this straw. So this little part right here is called the rostrum, and it actually has mandibles. They're just modified to be piercers, and it has maxilla, and the maxilla actually, I'll show you a diagram of them later, but they're basically they form two straws inside the mouth parts. So you have the mandibles on the outside and the maxilla on the inside, and the maxilla form both kind of an in-current and ex-current siphon, so you can both put digestive enzymes and venom into the prey and then liquefy it, and then you can slurp out the liquefied milkshake bee from the other tube. So pretty amazing. Those are mandibulate versus haustellate mouth parts. And those are the two main categories because they have all the characteristics of insect mouth parts. You can see here on the grasshopper, we have the mandibles here, and here you can see a pretty ferocious looking grasshopper. One interesting thing about grasshoppers is that they eat grass, not surprisingly, and grass, also not surprisingly, doesn't want to be eaten, and grass protects itself by putting a bunch of silica, little shards of glass, inside its leaves. So the leaves of grass, you may have been sliced up a little bit by grass before on your feet or ankles. That's because of the silica in the grass leaves. So if you eat grass, you have to have these massive mandibles to chomp down and break up the leaves. Over time, these edges will wear down, and you can almost tell the age of a grasshopper based on how worn their mandibles are. If they live long enough and don't get eaten by something, they will eventually starve to death because their mandibles will get so worn down that they can no longer crunch the grass appropriately. Poor grasshoppers. So I want to point out that you have, in insect mouthparts, you have a dorsoventrally opposed mouthpart, and that is the labrum, the upper lip, and then the labium, the lower lip. And the labrum and the labium are kind of keep everything together. And then you have the laterally opposed appendages, the mandible and the maxilla. So while the labrum and the labium kind of keep everything together, the mandible and the maxilla are crunching it from the sides. And all three of these, all four of these, the labrum, the labium, the mandibles, and the maxillae, are found in mandibulate and haustellate mouthparts. In mosquitoes, I want to show you a few different modifications because mouthparts are going to be an important distinguishing character between different orders. So mosquitoes also have sucking mouthparts that are similar to haustellate, but they're different because it's the labium that is extensively modified to be the piercer, and it's not the maxilla and the mandibles as in normal haustellate mouthparts. So mosquitoes use a modified labium. Similarly, butterflies also have sucking mouthparts for delivering nectar from flowers into their bodies, but they don't really have mandibles or a labium to speak of. Rather, their straw is composed of the maxillae that both form this nice siphoning funnel, and they can curl up when they're at rest, and then when they want to eat, they extend it out in some species almost the length of their body to drink nectar. And then houseflies and also in bees, it's the labium that's extensively modified. In houseflies, the labium forms these little spongy mouth parts to sop up food, and in bees, it forms this little tongue-like structure that is used to lap up nectar from flowers. So the generalized structure is the grasshopper, so know that, and then know how it's modified in haustellate mouthparts, and then know the general features of other specific groups like the mosquito, butterfly, and fly. Here is the cross-section I was telling you earlier about the haustellate mouthparts. So here you have the labrum and the labium, and then you have the mandible and the maxilla. And if we were looking at it from the other way, we'd see that the maxilla kind of forms, it almost looks like a figure 8, where you have two barrels to a shotgun. And the salivary pump is going to pump things in through one maxilla, and then the cibarium here is a pharyngeal pump that's going to pump all the digestive juices from their prey back into the body. So you have two working pumps, pumping in and pumping out. And I also want to point out that you have palps, which are going to be for sensing and tasting and feeling, and these are going to, actually let me point those out here first. You're going to have little palps here on the maxilla and the labium. So you're going to have maxillary palps and labial palps. The labium is the most ventral and or posterior, depending on how you're looking at the head, and then the maxilla is more anterior. So this right here is going to be the maxillary palp, and this is going to be the labial palp. And typically the maxillary palps are longer, and you should be able to look at an insect head like this and identify the maxillary palp from the labial palp. You should recognize that this is the labrum, and then these right here are the maxilla, divided by this line right there. Now, how do insects lay eggs, or give birth, I should say, because oviparity means they lay eggs, and viviparity means they give birth to live young. This is a really interesting species here. This is the green lacewing, and as adults, they have mandibulate mouthparts, and as larvae, they have mandibulate mouthparts, but the mandibles in the larvae are hollow tubes, and they just stab their prey, and they're almost like the assassin bug. They'll stab and kind of slurp up juices. This is the lacewing larva, and it likes eating aphids, and you can see it kind of camouflages itself with lichen and moss and things. So if you ever see a little piece of moss that's walking around, if you pick that up and look underneath, you'll probably find a little lacewing larva. But they begin their life as these as these little eggs right here. And they're laid on long stalks. Why would they be laid on long stalks? Well, a long time ago, do you guys remember Hyalonema, the glass rope sponge? It has a silica-based stalk that embeds into the ocean floor. It's the same idea here. So there are a lot of predators and parasitoids that are looking to eat or lay eggs in these eggs. And so by putting it on a stalk, if you have a little predator walking along here and it meets this, it's not going to think that's something juicy to eat, so it's going to keep on walking. If there's an egg right here, it would just munch it up. So these stalked eggs prevent predation. They also prevent parasitoids, and this is really interesting because remember the tiny little fairy wasp I was telling you about? Those guys are so small that, this is not a long stalk. This is just a leaf of a plant. But the difference between temperature and wind between here and here is phenomenal. So a microscopic wasp, they usually hang out right here along the surface of the leaf because you have really warm temperatures and there's very low wind. So you have this nice little micro habitat right there. If they get up here, it gets way too turbulent and they can't fly anymore. So putting these eggs on stalks helps them from getting injected by parasitoid wasp eggs. Why was I telling you that? Because it's cool and because that's oviparity. So these are egg-laying animals. Oviparity means you lay an egg. Viviparity means you give live birth. So the eggs are incubated in some type of modified uterus or a legitimate uterus. And then you give birth to live young. So this is an aphid, the prey species of our lacewing friend over there. And aphids often give birth to live young. And what's remarkable about aphids is that they are sexually mature at birth. And so it is technically possible, although it's probably never been seen before, but it's technically possible that an aphid could give birth to an aphid giving birth, which is phenomenal population growth. So aphids are pretty well-known garden pests, and part of the reason they become pests is because they have tremendous population growth when there's plenty of resources, partially because they are birthed sexually mature. And so pretty remarkable. They basically reproduce asexually for a time, and then part of their life cycle they actually reproduce sexually. And I bet you can predict when they would reproduce sexually and when they would reproduce asexually based on your knowledge of other things. When you're thinking about development in insects, there are primarily two different kinds of development. We have hemimetabolous development and holometabolous development, and this is going to be incomplete metamorphosis versus complete metamorphosis. Complete metamorphosis being what you guys are all familiar with the caterpillar transforming into a butterfly. We'll talk about hemimetabolism first. So hemimetabolous development, they begin as little eggs, sometimes little adorable eggs like these little stink bug eggs, or these grasshopper eggs. So stink bugs and grasshoppers are both examples of hemimetabolous insects. Stink bugs lay these barrel-shaped eggs in rows, and usually on the underside of plant leaves. And then grasshoppers lay these ootheca, or egg cases, and they bury them deep under the soil. So these little egg cases are filled with many little grasshopper eggs, and they're buried underground. After they hatch, you get adorable little grasshoppers and adorable little bugs. And so here, what you notice is that this looks like a grasshopper. This looks like a bug. And so the immature forms are called nymphs, or sometimes instars, and they look very similar to adults. And as they molt, they go from early instar nymphs to later instars. Usually they'll have 5 molts before they become adults, and they just grow larger and larger and larger. And then when they molt from juveniles to adults, from their last nymphal stage to adults, they gain 2 important traits. The first is wings, so get a nice little wing bonus as adults, and then you also get sexual reproductive organs. So you can tell a nymph from an adult because they don't have any wings. no wings, and no reproductive organs. You don't see an ovipositor out of here yet. So again, stink bugs and grasshoppers are good examples of hemimetabolous insects, and they gain wings and reproductive organs as they move on to adulthood. So here are some adults. This on the left is the stink bug with a face like a man, because it's got little eyes, little grimace, nice, well coiffed hair. And this is the stink bug with a face like a man, and this is just a really goofy looking grasshopper. It kind of mimics a stick and moves very slowly through the grass, and it looks like a nice little Pixar character, but it's a real life grasshopper. So these are the adults, and so they're going to have wings and they're going to have reproductive organs. So hemimetabolous, egg, nymph, adult, and the nymphs look like miniature versions of the adults, minus wings and sexual organs. Contrast that with holometabolous, which is going to go from egg to larva to pupae and then to adult. And these, so here on the left we have some butterfly eggs, and here on the right we have some beetle eggs. And these are the two main groups of holometabolous insects, but there are many others. Flies are a really important group. So butterflies versus caterpillars. No, sorry, I got distracted by my son. Butterflies and beetles are holometabolous. And when those eggs are hatched, they emerged larvae. So nymphs are hemimetabolous, larvae are holometabolous. And here we have a saddleback caterpillar that will eventually grow into a moth. And here we have a grub, which will eventually grow into a beetle. And so you can see the mandibles on the grub. You can see the toxic venom bristles on the saddleback caterpillar. And so usually the larvae are going to have different names. Larvae of butterflies and moths are called caterpillars. The larvae of beetles are called grubs. And the larvae of flies are called maggots. Here is a really interesting larva. And do you guys recognize what this one is? These are very, very common, very important creatures. This is the larva of a ladybug. So this is a little baby ladybug. It doesn't look anything like a ladybug, and that's why this is called complete metamorphosis, holometabolous metamorphosis, because the larvae look completely different than the adults. They're going to occupy different habitats, they're going to eat different things, and they're going to look different. Once these are mature, they're going to make pupa, and the pupal cases are going to be quite elaborate in some groups. And we'll talk about chrysalis versus a cocoon. So in butterflies, most of the time they're going to make something called a chrysalis for their pupal stage. And the chrysalis, the difference between a chrysalis and a cocoon, there are two main ones. The first is that the chrysalis, the outer wrapping of the chrysalis, is made from the epidermis of the caterpillar itself. So the actual exoskeleton, when they'll shed, and then they make this oftentimes highly ornamental, elaborate chrysalis from their own skin. In contrast, cocoons are external structures. So this log cabin caterpillar this isn't the epidermis of the caterpillar, but rather they have beautifully handcrafted, organic, artisan log cabin caterpillar. These guys have made these little structures from random bits that they find around, and then they glue them together with some silk. And so cocoons are external structures. Inside of there's going to be a little a pupa of a moth in there, but it's protected by external stuff and held together with silk, and that's different than the chrysalis. Here is a beetle larva going through its whole development. Can get quite gigantic. This is one of the largest beetles on Earth. This is the Hercules beetle, and here it is forming its final molt from larva to pupa. and the pupal stage will go through a process of hardening called tanning, and so it'll be dark brown, but you can still see it's alive. And inside here, it's transforming into a completely different organism, and it's really incredibly phenomenal change that occurs from that little juicy grub to this exquisitely beautiful Hercules beetle. So it's just a completely different organism, right? That's pretty phenomenal. And then eventually you get beautiful adults like that Hercules beetle, or like this butterfly, or like this beetle. This is an up-close picture of a weevil, which is a specialized kind of beetle. You can see the antenna here. It's got little mandibles right at the end of its snout. And these aren't dangerous at all, and you shouldn't be afraid of them. In fact, even Scripture talks about this when it says you should fear no weevil. And so these are not dangerous insects at all.